Hello and welcome to my presentation for Observación y Práctica. The title of this presentation is Young Learners' Attention and Memory from a Neuroscientific Approach. And I will provide now an overview of the different topics that I will be talking about so it is easier for you to follow while I speak. Well, firstly, I will begin by referring to my and yours experience as a young learner and the memories that we may have from our teachers. Secondly, I'll provide by means of a quote different concepts that are really important from neuroscience and that are key for this presentation. Finally, I will talk a little bit about some activities that we can take into account for the release of certain hormones and things that we should avoid if we don't want to interfere in the learning process from our learners. So, let's begin. Well, when I was going through the topic of this presentation, it was inevitable for me to think of myself as a young learner. And I thought of my teachers and the experiences I had with them. And with some of them, it wasn't that good, since the topics that they taught me have disappeared from my memory. And this may also have happened to you. Do you remember those things that your teacher told you when you were a kid? And if the answer is yes, do you remember how they approached the teaching of the subject? Well, the relationship between what they taught and the things that we still remember from our childhood and how good these memories are may have to do with the way the teachers approached the teaching of the subject. When we think of ourselves as English teachers, we tend to forget one of the most important aspects of teaching in general, that we, as teachers, have direct access to our learners' brains. Even if we don't know or if we know about neuroscience, we can have an impact on our learners' cognitive development and what they will remember in the future. Aristotle said, if you want to know how a system works, you need to know first what the origin of that system is. That is, if we want to know how to teach, how to approach our learners, how they learn, well, have you ever considered that what we need to learn first is how the brain works? That is the origin of the system, the origin of how they learn, and one of the most important things for teachers. And knowing how our young learners can get to understand our classes can give us a deep insight of how to improve our classes or what to avoid from our classes. And the way to have access to that insight is by neuroscience. Then, let's talk about now these concepts. What is neuroscience? Neuroscience is the study, of course, of the brain and different cognitive functions that have an impact on our behavior and different things that we do on a daily basis. In this presentation, the concept of cognitive neuroscience, that is a subfield of neuroscience, is important since it involves the study of cognitive functions such as learning, and from a linguistic point of view, it also involves the study of how language is learned and how it is decoded and stored in our brains. Another concept that is really important is that of educational neuroscience, that focuses not only in our brains, but also how our connections that are made in the brain have an impact on our curriculum and educational practices. Among the many and varied brain functions that are studied in neuroscience, the ones that are developed in this presentation are those of attention and memory. Attention is a complex activity in our brains that stores, decodes, and keeps language input in the working or short-term memory, and then it is retrieved from the long-term memory. Now that I mentioned memory, what is memory? Well, memory is the ability to decode, store, and retain information from all the experiences that we live in our lives in our brains. These two brain functions are of paramount importance for us teachers, since what is stored in our memories needs to be meaningful and relevant. So what we need to take into account in our classes is that if the information is not meaningful nor relevant for our learners, it will move on to the long-term memory. We already know that young learners have very short attention span compared to that of teenagers or adults. But this can be seen as a disadvantage, but if we take into account that young learners are very curious, that can be very beneficial for us, since curiosity leads to an increase in the neurons activation and in the brain waves, which also leads to an increase in this increase in neuron activation happens in the hippocampus, that is an area of the brain which is essential for memorization. In relation to memory and attention, there is another concept that is really important for us, and that is of executive function skills. These functions include the ability that all humans and animals have to avoid distraction, pay attention, and hold relevant information. In practice, the promotion of these functions can help students or any human being, but in this case, students, to master efficiently and effectively the contents that we are teaching. So, for us, it's really important to know how to promote these functions. And now I will explain or propose certain ways in which we can promote these functions. And one of them is through physical movement. From our prehistoric times, we learn through moving. We need to move, and we are not accustomed to be sat still. We think that our learners can't pay attention and they need to move. And this is because that is connected to one of the ancient survival strategies. And it is also connected, the physical movement, to their long-term memories. So by moving, if we foster movement in our classes, we are also having a connection with our long-term memories, because we bring this knowledge from our ancient times, and therefore we are having this connection between what is already learned and what they are learning now. So it can be very beneficial for our classes too. Another way to promote these functions, the executive function skills, is by anticipating learners what are our goals. This is so because these functions are always driven by goals. So if we tell our learners what we want to achieve with them, they will learn how to plan, how to monitor what they are achieving, and to achieve again this sense of accomplishment, to see what we are going through the year. In relation to the executive function skills, the release of hormones is very important too. If we talk about hormones, these are the ones that are responsible for happiness or for battling stress. They have a direct impact on the learning process, because as we already know, emotions are very powerful when it comes to learning. So I'll begin by talking about music and relaxation. By means of the state of relaxation, we increase our brain waves. And a way of relaxing is by having background music, because apart from being in a peaceful state, we have this peaceful, it is called peaceful receptivity, in which we feel relaxed, but at the same time we are more attentive to what is around us and what we are hearing. This is also connected to our prehistoric ancient strategies for survival. Another way that we have already discussed in this subject is the use of stories and role plays. Stories and role plays are an integral part of the curriculum of happiness. This is so because by means of when learners can create their own version of stories, we are fostering deep learning. That is, they have the possibility to think and to feel at the same time. And as I said before, when we connect learning with emotions, it is proved that it will probably last longer in the long-term memories. In the case of role plays, when we allow students to imagine and to position themselves in different roles, this affects their brain plasticity, and it helps to the release of dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is connected to motivation. And when something makes us release dopamine, it makes us want to repeat that action again and again and again, because sometimes it causes addiction. This neurotransmitter is also related to rewards and reinforcement, and eventually to attention, because what is rewarding for us makes us pay attention to it the next time we do it, because we are enjoying what we are doing. So the question is how to release, or how to help the release of this hormone in our classes. Well, I will propose now two very easy ways in which dopamine is released. The first one is through predictions. Generally, when we are at the pre-storytelling stage or pre-listening stage, we make our learners predict or guess what the story or what the audio is going to be about, or how the ending is going to be. So by means of these predictions, students feel the motivation to listen or to pay attention to the story, and at the same time, if the predictions are then correct, this increases the release of dopamine, making the students want to repeat that action and that task in the future. Another way in which dopamine is released is with our feedback. When we give feedback and when the students feel that what they have done is correct, is what they expected to get, that increases their release of this hormone. So we need to be very careful when we give feedback, because it has an impact on their emotions and, of course, in their motivation. And now I'm reaching the end of the presentation, and in this part I want to talk about these things that may represent an obstacle for learners in their learning process. To begin with, I'll talk about visual distractions. Sometimes we think that the more, the better. And we want to help visual learners. We think that young learners are or prefer these visual stimuli in the classroom, but in the end, this can be very distracting. When the classroom is too much decorated, it represents a distraction for learners, and it is proved that in the end they lose the focus of the task, and they start talking to their classmates, or they start moving around because they got tired of being sat still. And even sometimes the things that are on the walls are not even related to the topics that we are teaching or even the subject. So in this case, it is preferred to avoid too much decoration on the classroom. And in the second place, let's say, the other thing that we need to avoid is long and confusing instructions. Sometimes we want to make our instructions clearer, and we end up talking too much and explaining long instructions. And what happens is that our learners got lost in the few seconds that we started, and we are losing our time, and they start misbehaving in some cases. So we know that working memory has its limits, and it depends on age, but sometimes we want to stretch those limits and we exceed the limits and we cram up too much in a lesson or an instruction, and that doesn't help for our memories. So we have reached the ending of this long presentation. I hope I didn't bore you so much. To conclude, I would like to say that I am in favor of a holistic way of teaching. That is, we know that our learners have many interests, and they have different motivations, and they have different cultural backgrounds, and they learn in different ways. And of course that we need to take all those things into account when we arrive at the classroom. But I think that it's really important also to incorporate neuroscientific knowledge in our teaching if we want our classes to be memorable and meaningful. Sometimes we take many things into account, but we forget how our learners learn, how the process of learning is stored, and how our memories work. So in the end, if we want our classes to be memorable, we need to focus not only on those important things such as motivation or cultural background, but also on the biologic side of our brains. So this is the end. Thank you very much for listening, for your attention.